Good evening. Tonight we are going back to a world that once seemed permanent, a world of bronze blades and cedar beams, of clay tablets and palace gates, of kings who wrote to one another across mountains and seas, of caravans carrying tin and copper, of scribes recording treaties, of priests whispering prayers beneath flickering temple light. And in that world, around 1200 BC, something extraordinary happened. A civilization disappeared, not a village, not a tribe at the edge of a map, not some tiny kingdom swallowed by a stronger neighbor. A true civilization, a major power, one of the great states of the Bronze Age. It had armies, it had roads, it had archives, temples, officials, and a capital city ringed with walls. It negotiated with Egypt. It ruled over vassals. It moved through the same political world as pharaohs and kings, and then, somehow, it was gone. What makes the mystery stranger is not only that this civilization disappeared, it is that it seems to have vanished in a kind of silence. No great dramatic ending preserved for posterity. No single famous final battle remembered by every neighbor and people. No clear chorus of witnesses standing safely nearby to say, yes, this was the end. So tonight, in the slow and quiet way that history often prefers, we're going to ask a deceptively simple question. How can something enormous disappear? And why did no one seem to notice? Our story centers on the Hittite Empire, a great Bronze Age power whose capital stood at Hattusa in the highlands of Anatolia. For centuries, the Hittites were among the mightiest people in the Near East, and then in the chaos of the late Bronze Age, their imperial world unraveled. But the deeper you look, the stranger the story becomes, because perhaps no one noticed for the saddest possible reason. Perhaps nobody noticed because everyone else was falling too. So tonight, let your breathing slow. Let the modern world soften a little around the edges. And together, we will move gently through palace courtyards, mountain roads, temple precincts, borderlands, coastal ports, famine years, anxious letters, and abandoned gates. We will walk into a lost world, not at the moment of its triumph, but at the moment when triumph had started to feel tired, when confidence began to thin, when roads became uncertain, when messages stopped arriving, when one more failed harvest, one more raiding party, one more delayed shipment, one more nervous treaty, one more broken alliance began to add up to something much larger than the people living through it could fully name. Because collapse rarely announces itself. It whispers first, and in a strange way, that is why this ancient mystery feels so haunting. A civilization did not disappear because no one cared. It disappeared because history itself was breaking apart around it. So settle in. You do not need to remember every name or every date. This is a story to drift through. A story of a world connected by bronze, by diplomacy, by fear, by ritual, and by hope. A story of how systems grow grand enough to impress the world and fragile enough to fail all at once. And by the end, perhaps the mystery will feel a little clearer. Not simpler, but clearer. Because the answer is not hidden in one villain, one battle, or one single dramatic night. The answer lies in a world so interconnected that when one pillar cracked, many others cracked with it. And in that widening fracture, the Hittite Empire slipped away. So close your eyes if you like. Picture high stone walls in the Anatolian dusk. Picture a road climbing toward a capital. Picture a messenger arriving too late. Picture clay tablets drying in silence. And let us begin. Part 1. The world before the silence. Before a civilization disappears, it must first feel secure. That is one of history's gentlest deceptions. From far away, we often imagine ancient collapse as obvious. Surely we think the signs must have been clear. Surely the people of the time must have looked around and known that they were standing near the edge of a cliff. But that is rarely how it feels from the inside. From the inside, the world still looks like the world. The roads are still there, the officials still write, the temple's still open. The king still issues commands, bread is still baked, taxes are still counted, children still play in courtyards, animals still move through gates. And so the first place we should begin is not with the end, but with the long, impressive world that existed before it. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was not a scattered wilderness of isolated peoples. It was a highly connected international system. Not modern, of course, not industrial, not fast in the way we think of speed today, but deeply linked. Kingdoms traded with one another, courts exchanged gifts. Royal daughters were married for diplomacy. Scribes copied letters between distant rulers. Merchants crossed seas and mountain passes. Copper and tin moved across astonishing distances, and, when combined, became bronze, the metal that armed soldiers, shaped tools, and supported entire economies. This world had its own international order. Egypt stood to the south, wealthy, old, monumental, and river-fed. Mesopotamian powers rose and shifted to the east. Assyria would become especially important. Babylonia held prestige and political weight. The Mycenaean world stretched across the Aegean. Cyprus mattered for copper. The Levantine coast glowed with ports and trade cities. And in Anatolia, in what is now much of modern Turkey, the Hittites built one of the greatest empires of the age. And when we say the Hittites were major players, we mean exactly that. They were not an obscure people hiding in the hills, and they were a state whose rulers made war, signed treaties, managed vassals, and competed directly with Egypt for influence in Syria. For a long time, they succeeded. Their capital, Hattusa, was not some simple fort. It was a great city with monumental walls, gates, temples, administrative buildings, and archives. The terrain around it offered natural strength, but the city itself was also a statement that power lived here, that order lived here, that this was a place from which kings governed. Empires often construct themselves not only out of force, but out of visibility. The capital must be seen. A king must feel distant and near at once. His power must be built into the walls, stored in the granaries, repeated in rituals, and confirmed by the very act of writing itself. That is one reason ancient archives matter so much. The Hittites wrote. They left legal texts, treaties, myths, prayers, administrative records, inventories, correspondence, and royal annals. Through these texts, the empire still speaks faintly to us. Through them, we see not only events, but habits. We see bureaucracy. We see concern with grain, with gods, with loyalty, with boundaries, with ritual correctness, with politics. And this is important because it helps us understand that the Hittite Empire was not crude, it was sophisticated, it had memory, it had procedure. It had a state's favorite tools, records, hierarchy, obligation, ceremony. And for centuries, those tools helped the Hittites thrive. But all such systems depend on something deeper, continuity. And continuity is more fragile than it looks. Imagine the empire in one of its stronger years. Messengers ride between cities. Officials keep count of tribute. Priests attend to the gods. Metal workers heat furnaces. Storehouses fill with grain. Vassal rulers send assurances. Border commanders report upward. The king and court assume that what existed yesterday will continue tomorrow. That assumption is one of the invisible foundations of civilization. Not stone, not bronze, expectation. A civilization is, in part, a set of expectations that hold long enough to feel natural, that food will arrive, that roads will be passable, that local governors will obey, that trade partners will continue trading, that the weather will remain survivable, that enemies can be held back, that a kingdom's center can still reach its edges. And when those expectations begin to fail, a civilization enters a dangerous phase. At first, it still looks normal. That's what makes ancient collapse so difficult to see in real time. A failed harvest can be explained away as a bad year. A border raid is unpleasant but familiar. A delayed shipment is frustrating but temporary. A rebellious vassal may still be contained. A tense royal succession may still resolve itself. One problem is a problem. Several at once become a condition. And when a condition spreads across the whole system, the people living through it often do not have a neat name for what is happening. They only know that things are harder. Harder this year than last, harder in the north than before. Harder to feed the army, harder to trust the road, and harder to collect tribute, harder to keep allies close, harder to know what news is true, harder to feel certain that the center still holds. That phrase, the center still holds, may be the quiet core of tonight's mystery, because Hittite power depended on a center, a capital, a court, an administrative heart, a ritual heart, a political heart. And when that center could no longer bind the empire together, the system did not simply collapse in one theatrical instant. It loosened. A little here, a little there, then more. And because the entire Eastern Mediterranean world was under pressure around the same time, there was no stable audience left to narrate the end from a safe distance. That is the key we will return to again and again tonight. No one seemed to notice because the noticers were also in trouble. But before we get there, we should linger a little longer in the world that once seemed strong. Picture the roads of late Bronze Age Anatolia. Not broad, paved highways in the modern sense, but routes known by use, shaped by terrain, by animal traffic, by wheeled carts, by foot messengers, by military movement. Some passed through valleys, some crossed uplands, some linked villages to larger towns, and those towns to the imperial center. Now picture the seasonal rhythm of that world. Winter could make movement slow. Summer heat could parch land and strain labor. Harvest time mattered intensely. Storage mattered. Timing mattered. Everything depended on the ability to gather, move, record, and redistribute resources. This was not a river empire like Egypt leaning on a great annual flood. This was a highland state with different environmental challenges. That made planning all the more essential. The Hittite state, like many ancient states, was in some sense a machine for organizing risk. It could not control the sky. It could not guarantee harvests. It could not erase distance. But it could build granaries, enforce obligations, mobilize labor, move troops, demand tribute, call on vassals, negotiate treaties, and appeal to divine order. And for a long time that was enough, until slowly it wasn't. Part 2. Hattusa, City of Kings. If you want to understand why the disappearance of the Hittites feels so eerie, you have to imagine Hattusa alive. Not as ruins, not as excavation plans, not as stones under open sky. Alive. A capital city is never just a place. It is a concentration of confidence. Hattusa stood in the central Anatolian landscape, ringed by strong defenses and monumental architecture. It was built into hilly terrain in a way that made it both dramatic and defensible. Walls followed the contours of the land. Gates marked movement in and out. Administrative and religious spaces made power visible. To approach the city in its flourishing period would have been to feel, almost physically, the presence of order. You would pass through lands bound into the orbit of the state. You would see signs of management, roads, fields, movement, settlements, linked to larger authority. And then, as the city came into view, the abstract idea of empire would become stone. Great ancient capitals did that. They turned belief into architecture. Hattusa contained official buildings, storehouses, temples, residences, workshops, and the records of the kingdom. There were districts for different functions, ceremonial spaces, and the marks of generations of building and rebuilding. In such a city, thousands of daily motions created the impression of permanence. Someone rose before dawn to light a fire. Someone swept a courtyard. Someone checked seals on stored goods. Someone counted jars. Someone prepared offerings. Someone rehearsed a formal greeting for a visiting official. Someone worried over missing livestock. Someone baked bread. Someone copied a text. Someone stood guard. Someone waited for word from a frontier town. This is what is so moving about ancient cities. They are not only sites of kings and monuments. They are accumulations of ordinary gestures, and ordinary gestures are what make a civilization real. A child running under a gateway, a servant carrying water from one level of the city to another, a metal worker listening to the change in tone when a furnace reaches the right heat, a priest reciting words that had already been old when his grandfather heard them, a scribe pressing signs into wet clay with the concentration of someone who knows that wording matters. The Hittites left enough behind that we can sense a world of routine beneath the grandeur. Routine is the heartbeat of empire. Without routine, a kingdom is only an ambition. The city's walls themselves mattered in a practical and symbolic way. Walls kept danger out, yes, but they also announced that the city inside them was worth protecting. Gates did more than regulate entry. They created thresholds. They said, beyond this point, you enter a place where power has shape, name, and memory. A capital also absorbs people from different places, officials from dependent regions, envoys from other courts. Merchants bringing news, soldiers rotated in and out, laborers summoned for specific work, priests preserving regional traditions that had been folded into imperial religious life. Because the Hittite realm was not culturally simple, it was a composite world built by conquest, administration, adaptation, and inheritance. Its religion especially reflects that complexity. Deities and rituals from different local traditions were gathered into a wider, imperial frame. In some ways, the Hittites ruled not only territory, but diversity. That takes work. A state must be strong to hold different peoples together, but it must also be flexible. Too rigid and it breaks under its own weight. Too loose and it dissolves. The Hittites walked that line for centuries. And Hattusa was where that balancing act was staged and reinforced. Imagine standing in one of the city's important precincts during a festival. Movement everywhere. Animals brought for offerings, food prepared in quantity. Priests in careful sequence, officials watching protocol. The king or his representatives attached to sacred order. The city made luminous by ceremony. Ancient states often survived not only by force or wealth, but by convincing people that their political order and the cosmic order belong together. When a kingdom can say, in effect, this is not only how power works, but how the world should work, it becomes harder to imagine its absence. That is why collapse feels so shocking in hindsight. Because once such a city exists, it becomes difficult for the people inside it to imagine that it might one day be empty. A capital teaches permanence through repetition. The gates open every morning. Officials assemble. Messages are received. Rituals are performed. Accounts are checked. Orders are issued. And if this has happened not just for 1 year, but for generations, then stability begins to feel natural. But stability is never natural. It is maintained. That distinction matters. The larger and more complex the state, the more maintenance it requires. Not only roads and walls, but loyalties. Not only granaries, but trust. Not only armies, but supply. Not only ritual, but belief in the ritual's efficacy. Not only archives, but the confidence that records will matter tomorrow. If tomorrow becomes uncertain enough, the value of all these things begins to shift. A scribe's work matters differently in a shrinking world. A distant treaty matters differently when the roads are unsafe. A capital's prestige matters differently when provinces can no longer be reached. A temple's offerings matter differently when grain is scarce. A governor's oath matters differently when reinforcements cannot come, and yet, while the structure still stands, people go on acting as if it holds. This may be the most poignant thing about Hattusa. For years, perhaps decades, life there continued under pressure. The city did not wake one morning to a sign reading, "Civilization ending today." Instead, its people likely faced increments of strain, a bad report, a delayed caravan, a nervous rumor from the coast, news that a vassal was wavering, an order to redistribute grain, anxious appeals from elsewhere. The sense that more and more of the empire's energy was being spent on emergency. Even powerful centers can become exhausted. The eye of empire gets tired. The capital has to keep responding, keep issuing, keep sending, keep storing, keep praying, keep pretending that difficulty is still manageable. Sometimes that works. Sometimes the capital survives. And sometimes the center reaches a point where it can no longer convert command into result. When that happens, a state enters a new phase. The problem is no longer just what threatens it from outside. The problem is that its own mechanisms begin to lose force. A command sent too late is a weak command. A promise made without resources is a weak promise. A threat unsupported by troops is a weak threat. A prayer performed without confidence becomes fragile too. Hattusa, magnificent though it was, could not stand outside the conditions of the wider world. It depended on grain, on roads, on obedience, on movement, on stability beyond its own walls. And once those wider supports weakened, the city's greatness became harder to sustain. That is the paradox of capitals. Their grandeur reveals power, but it also reveals how much power must constantly be fed. A village can endure scarcity more quietly than a palace can. A small local network may survive where a vast central administration fails. The bigger the organism, the more it must keep circulating. Hattusa was not small, it was a heart. And hearts can fail not only from attack, but from strain. Part 3, A Brotherhood of Kings. One reason the disappearance of the Hittites feels so mysterious is that they belonged to a world that was surprisingly international. When many people imagine the ancient world, they picture separate civilizations living in relative isolation. But the late Bronze Age was full of contact. Not constant peace, of course, not harmony, but contact. Kings sent letters to other kings. Courts exchanged gifts of gold, textiles, horses, vessels, precious stones, and crafted luxuries. Royal marriages were diplomatic acts. Messages moved across long distances with formulas, expectations, etiquette, complaints, and negotiations. This was a world in which powerful rulers sometimes addressed one another as brothers. That did not mean affection. It meant rank. It meant a club of the very powerful, each measuring himself against the others, each insisting on honor, proper gifts, correct address, and recognition. This diplomatic culture appears vividly in the surviving correspondence of the age. To belong to that network was to be visible. The Hittite kings were visible. That is why their disappearance later feels so strange. How could a civilization important enough to negotiate with Egypt and contest Syria simply fade from the stage? Part of the answer lies in the fact that the stage itself was collapsing. But let us not rush there. First, let us sit for a while in the world before the curtains began to burn. Imagine a Hittite envoy making a long journey. He carries messages, perhaps sealed and carefully composed by scribes. He knows formulas of respect. He may carry gifts or receive them. He travels roads, river crossings, mountain passes, or maritime segments, depending on the route. His presence is political. In the Bronze Age, diplomacy was not abstract, and it moved in bodies. An envoy could be delayed by weather, by local unrest, by war, by poor supplies, by banditry, by changing alliances. Time itself was part of diplomacy. A message sent too slowly could lose its force. A ruler waiting too long for an answer might interpret delay as insult or weakness. Still, the system worked often enough that powerful states could think in international terms. The Hittites did. Their empire extended influence into Syria, a region of enormous strategic importance. Whoever controlled the Syrian routes and cities could shape trade, military movement, and prestige. This was one reason the Hittites and Egypt collided at Kadesh, one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. The battle itself is often remembered for its scale, drama, and royal self-presentation, especially in Egyptian sources. But perhaps what matters most tonight is what came after: treaty, recognition, diplomacy. Two great powers could fight, fail to crush one another, and then settle into a structured relationship. That alone tells us how sophisticated the system had become. War did not erase the diplomatic order. It existed inside it. Kings could threaten and flatter, demand and negotiate, boast and concede. The Bronze Age was not peaceful, but it was organized enough that power often worked through channels other than immediate destruction. This made the world richer and more fragile, because the more interdependent the major states became, the more trouble in one region could ripple elsewhere. Suppose a trade route becomes unsafe, metal deliveries slow, workshops feel it. Weapons and tools become harder to produce. Political promises tied to exchange weaken. Merchants take greater risks or stay home. Prices shift. Trust shifts. Suppose harvests fail in more than one place. Rulers ask allies for grain. Local populations grow anxious. Garrisons require support. Administrative burdens increase. Vassals sense weakness. Suppose a contested region erupts. Great powers must choose whether to intervene. Intervention costs resources. Delay costs prestige. A connected world is efficient when things go well, but efficiency creates dependencies. The Hittites had long benefited from being central players in this network. By the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, that same network may have become part of the problem. If everything depends on everything else, then failure can travel. This is why the broader late Bronze Age collapse is often understood as a systems crisis rather than a single isolated event. Scholars debate exactly how much weight to give each factor, but many now see the breakdown as multi-causal and interconnected. Not one blow, many pressures. Not one invader, many instabilities. Not one night, a process. And in such a process, visibility becomes harder. A kingdom in trouble can usually be watched by neighbors. But if neighbors are also experiencing trouble, they are not watching with full attention. They are distracted, overburdened, improvising. This is where the mystery grows quieter and sadder. No one noticed, not because nothing was happening, but because too much was happening. The Hittites were not alone in the storm. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece were under strain and would collapse or be abandoned. Ugarit on the Levantine coast would face catastrophe. Other cities suffered destruction, disruption, or transformation. Egypt would endure attacks and deep pressure, even if it survived as a state. Assyria, too, had to navigate a changing and dangerous world. The so-called international age of the Bronze Age had created great reach, but reach can become vulnerability. To hold distant influence, a state needs reliable movement. To maintain alliances, it needs resources. To dominate politically, it needs internal confidence and external predictability. Take enough of those away, and even major powers can begin to shrink before they fully fall. Perhaps that is one reason the Hittite end feels so blurred. Their disappearance happened not against a calm backdrop, but within a failing international order. The diplomatic world that would normally preserve, observe, and react to a major political ending was itself disintegrating. Imagine a grand banquet hall where the great rulers of the age once metaphorically sat. Now imagine that the roof begins to leak, then the torches fail, then servants stop arriving, and then one doorway collapses, and then another. Then someone in the far corner cries out. Then the hall fills with smoke. In such a moment, the disappearance of one guest may go unrecorded, not because it is unimportant, but because the room itself is becoming impossible to manage. That is what makes the late Bronze Age so haunting. It is not a story of one empire falling while others stand proudly around it. It is a story of an age losing coherence, and the Hittites were among the great casualties of that loss. Still, before we leave this diplomatic world, let us linger on one final thought. For all its fragility, the Bronze Age system was real enough to create a shared political imagination. Rulers knew they were part of something larger. They compared themselves, negotiated status, worried about slights, and depended on networks beyond their borders. The Hittites belonged to that world fully, which means that when they vanished, they did not vanish from obscurity. They vanished from prominence, and perhaps that is why the silence afterward feels so deep. A civilization once known by kings became a buried memory. A participant in great international politics became, for a long time, an archaeological surprise. That is not a small fall. It is a tremendous one, and like many tremendous falls, it happened piece by piece. Civilizations are often described by their monuments, their walls, and their temples, and their palaces, their art. But monuments are the visible top of a much larger structure. Beneath them lies supply. No empire survives on stone alone. The Hittites, like their contemporaries, relied on the movement of practical things: grain, livestock, timber, textiles, metals, labor, tax obligations, draft animals, cart traffic, administrative attention, the smoothness of routine. And for a Bronze Age power, bronze itself mattered deeply. Bronze required copper and tin. Copper was available from places like Cyprus. Tin came through more complex networks from farther afield. This meant that the metal at the center of the age's military and tool-making systems depended on long chains of exchange. Long chains are efficient but delicate. If copper cannot arrive, workshops suffer. If tin cannot arrive, bronze production suffers. If maritime routes become unsafe, supply shrinks. If inland roads become dangerous, distribution shrinks. If courts cannot guarantee protection, merchants hesitate. A civilization can survive temporary disruption, but not infinite disruption. This is where the beauty and danger of the late Bronze Age become visible at the same time. It was a world rich in connection. Goods moved over surprising distances. States specialized, exchanged, and relied on one another. Luxury items and essential materials alike could travel far from their source. This made elite culture shine. It also made entire political systems more sensitive to disturbance. Think of a bronze sword in a Hittite armory. It appears solid, complete, singular, but it is actually the end point of many invisible processes. Ore extracted somewhere, metal transported, trade agreements maintained, craft knowledge preserved, fuel gathered, and workshop labor organized, political conditions kept stable enough for the whole chain to function. Every finished object hides a network, and every network is vulnerable. Grain, too, hides a network. A loaf of bread inside a palace kitchen is not just bread. It is weather, labor, land access, storage, taxation, milling, transport, and trust. Ancient states understood this. That is why they built granaries and recorded supplies. Food was not just nourishment, it was politics. It fed officials, priests, craftsmen, cities, and soldiers. A hungry empire grows nervous quickly. If harvest declined due to drought or broader climatic stress, the state would feel it everywhere. Not all at once, not in the same way, everywhere. But the pressure would travel. A bad year can be endured. 2 bad years become a problem. Several, combined with military and political troubles, can become fatal. There is evidence that some regions of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East experienced serious environmental stress in the period associated with the late Bronze Age collapse. The exact patterns and severity remain debated, but many historians and archaeologists believe climate pressure played a meaningful role. Even a modest downward shift in agricultural reliability can be dangerous in a tightly managed system, because ancient empires were not overflowing with margin. They could be rich, yes, but richness is not the same as flexibility. A palace economy often channels resources upward and outward efficiently, but it also creates concentration. If the center depends on inflows, then disruptions are immediately political. The Hittites had to feed a capital, maintain armies, support ceremonial life, and hold together a broad territory. That requires a steady pulse of plenty. Once plenty becomes uncertain, everything else begins to feel heavier. Command becomes harder. Distribution becomes contentious. Loyalty becomes expensive. Priestly rites become tinged with anxiety. Local elites become watchful. Common people become fearful. Scarcity changes the emotional weather of a state. Even before famine, the rumor of shortage can alter behavior. People hoard. Officials become stricter. Merchants charge more. Communities resent demands from the center. A province asked to send grain may wonder whether the capital can still protect it in return. This is how material strain becomes political strain. The Hittites had long experience managing difficult circumstances. They were not fragile because they lacked intelligence or discipline. They were fragile because even disciplined systems can be overwhelmed by too many simultaneous stresses. The great temptation in history is to imagine that collapse means incompetence. Often, it does not. Sometimes it means a competent system met a sufficiently bad combination of problems. That's not comforting exactly, but it is honest. Picture a Hittite administrator confronted with contradictory realities. The capital needs grain, the province is under pressure, roads are less safe, local populations are resentful, weather has been poor, enemies probe the borders, the king still expects order, the gods still expect ritual, the ledgers still need numbers. From the outside, historians may later say the system was failing. From the inside, the administrator is just trying to make the numbers work one more season. This is what collapse feels like before it becomes a historical category. It feels like management under strain. And because there is no neat dividing line between difficult administration and systemic failure, people can continue for a long time inside worsening conditions without fully realizing how close the whole structure is to breaking. That is another reason why no one noticed in the dramatic way we imagine. They noticed difficulty. They noticed shortages. They noticed danger. But difficulty is not yet apocalypse, not when you are living inside it. One of the saddest truths in ancient history is that large systems often fail while still issuing paperwork. The records continue. Orders continue, requests continue, appeals continue. The machine keeps trying to run until it doesn't. And when it stops, what remains are broken layers in the ground and a few last voices trapped in clay. For the Hittites, the grain problem and the trade problem may have converged with military and political problems in a particularly destructive way. If environmental stress reduced food security while maritime and overland exchange became more dangerous, then the empire was squeezed from more than one side at once. Not enough food, not enough reliable supply, too much danger, too many obligations. An empire can survive enemies. It can survive drought. It can survive rebellion. It can survive a weak ruler. But all of them together begin to form the shape of a different story, not a challenge, a collapse. Still, let us remain gentle here. The Hittite world did not simply flip from prosperity to void. There would have been years when the center still functioned, years when rituals continued, armies marched, letters were sent, storehouses were checked, years when many people still believed recovery was possible. Hope is also part of how civilizations endure, right up to the edge. A merchant waits for the next season, a commander waits for reinforcements, a priest waits for divine favor to return, a farmer waits for rain, a court waits for order to reassert itself. And sometimes waiting works. Sometimes the next season is better. But at the end of the Bronze Age in region after region, for state after state, it appears that the next season was not enough. And when enough not enough seasons accumulate, even a great civilization begins to fade. Empires rarely collapse first in the center. The edges begin to tremble. A road becomes unreliable. A border district reports unrest, and a tax shipment arrives late. A local ruler hesitates before obeying. A military outpost sends increasingly worried messages. From the capital, these signs may still look manageable. That is one reason great powers often underestimate what is happening to them. The center is accustomed to being the place where problems are solved. It assumes this role almost by reflex. News arrives as something to be handled. But when too many edge problems appear at once and the center lacks the strength to solve them all, the edge begins to loosen faster than the center can admit. The Hittite Empire faced dangers on more than one side. To the north were the Casca, groups long associated in Hittite history with instability and pressure. The northern frontiers were difficult terrain and often troublesome. To the west, the political landscape was complex and shifting, with regions not always easily controlled. To the south and southeast lay Syria and broader Near Eastern entanglements, regions that mattered strategically and demanded attention. Empires are often most vulnerable, not because they have one enemy, but because they have many kinds of difficulty at once. A northern problem uses troops. A western problem uses diplomacy. A southern problem uses both. A harvest problem uses grain reserves. A trade problem uses political capital. A succession problem uses elite trust. The same state must solve all of these with the same finite pool of people, time, resources, and confidence. That is exhausting, and there is something almost tragic in imagining late Hittite rulers trying to govern through such a landscape, because they were not passive men waiting for destiny to strike. They acted, they negotiated, they planned, they issued orders, they made appeals, they tried to preserve the realm. Yet the realm itself may have been becoming less governable. This is the hidden cruelty of large-scale collapse. It can make capable action look ineffective, not because the action is foolish, but because the field of crisis is too broad. Imagine an official map spread out before the court. One marker shows unrest in a frontier zone, another shows supply shortages elsewhere, another shows delayed communication, another suggests a vassal's waver in loyalty. Another warns of external threats, and another shows a need for immediate grain redistribution. Each problem demands response. Each response costs something. And because information travels slowly, the picture's always already incomplete. By the time one set of orders reaches its destination, conditions may have changed. This is how the edges begin to detach, not always by formal rebellion, sometimes by neglect, sometimes by missed support, sometimes by local adaptations, sometimes simply by the increasing irrelevance of the center's commands. A provincial official who can no longer rely on the capital may begin making more local decisions. A local ruler may decide survival matters more than distant loyalty. A community may fortify for itself rather than send what the state requests. A trade settlement may shrink its risks. A border district may quietly become its own first priority. These are not always dramatic acts of treason. Sometimes they are survival choices. Empires depend on the belief that the center is worth obeying. When that belief weakens, not because the center is hated, but because it seems tired or far away or unable to help, cohesion begins to dissolve. The Hittite Empire almost certainly experienced some version of this widening strain. The exact sequence in every region is lost to us, which is part of the melancholy of the subject. But the evidence we do have points toward a system under serious pressure in its later period. This is also why the collapse can feel silent, because what disappears first may not be the capital walls or the royal title. What disappears first is reach. If the center can no longer reach its edges in time, then the empire has already begun to shrink before anyone formally declares it. A letter unanswered, a convoy not protected, a grain request delayed, a military promise unmet. Tiny failures, repeated often enough, become geopolitical change. And again, most of this would not feel like civilization disappearing to the people involved. It would feel like worry, then frustration, then distrust, then local improvisation, and then a growing habit of not expecting much from the center at all. That habit is devastating. Once local populations stop expecting rescue or stability from the imperial core, the emotional architecture of empire cracks. A state is partly force, yes, but it is also expectation. If subjects, provinces, or allies no longer expect the center to function, then even the remaining structures begin to ring hollow. Still, there may have been moments when recovery seemed possible. Perhaps a successful redistribution of grain steadied a region. Perhaps one frontier was temporarily pacified. Perhaps one diplomatic move bought time. Perhaps one shipment arrived where it was needed most. History rarely moves in a clean slide from prosperity to ruin. It lurches, it stalls, it rallies, then breaks. That is one reason ancient collapse is so difficult to narrate. There is no single heartbeat to it. It is arrhythmic. Some places fail early, others endure longer. Some cities burn dramatically, others are slowly abandoned. Some institutions vanish, others survive in altered forms. The Hittite imperial center would ultimately disappear, but before that final disappearance, there were almost certainly many smaller absences. A road no longer traveled safely, and a district no longer firmly held, a communication channel no longer dependable, a ritual calendar interrupted, a specialist not replaced. Civilization is made of such threads, and it is unmade by them too. At the edges, the empire would have felt less like an abstract whole and more like a question. Will help come? Will grain arrive? Will the king act? Will the treaty hold? Will spring be kinder? Will the road reopen? Will the enemy return? Questions replace assumptions. That is how fear enters the bloodstream of a state. Once enough of the edges begin living in question marks, the center has to spend increasing energy pretending certainty. The court still issues commands, the temples still maintain order, the scribes still record, but all the while, on the margins, people are learning that the old guarantees no longer guarantee anything. And by the time the center fully understands how much has changed, the edges may already be living in a different world. No telling of the late Bronze Age collapse can completely avoid the shadowy figures later known through Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples. They loom over this era partly because they are dramatic, partly because the evidence is tantalizing, and partly because they have long been used as an explanation for wider collapse. But like so much in this story, the truth is probably more complex than a single invading force sweeping away civilization. Still, the fear they represent is real, and fear matters. When coastal settlements begin to dread attack, maritime trade suffers. When ships become associated with danger rather than connection, the sea itself changes politically. When ports face instability, inland states tied to maritime exchange feel the shock. The Eastern Mediterranean had long been a zone of movement. Goods, people, ideas, and power traveled across it. If that movement became more dangerous, the consequences would reach far beyond the coast. Cities like Ugarit give us some of the most haunting glimpses of this world in distress. Surviving texts from Ugarit include urgent communications that suggest imminent danger and a deeply strained situation. There is alarm in them. Not the polished language of later historians, but the immediate language of people trying to respond before it is too late. That matters deeply. Ancient collapse is not best understood through grand abstractions alone. It is also understood through moments of panic. A city writing for help, a ruler waiting for ships or troops, and an official sending warnings, a sense that the danger is moving faster than the bureaucracy. Even if the Sea Peoples were not the sole or primary cause of the Hittite collapse, they belong to the ecology of instability that defined the time. Raiding, migration, maritime violence, and the movement of distressed populations may all have fed into a wider breakdown. When states weaken, movement increases. People flee scarcity, groups seek new opportunities. Displaced populations put pressure on other populations. Coasts become vulnerable, ports become unstable. In that sense, the Sea Peoples may represent not a single magical explanation, but one visible symptom of a region under intense pressure. From the Hittite perspective, trouble on the coast would have mattered whether or not every detail was clearly understood. Maritime disruption could cut supply lines. It could damage trade relations. It could threaten client cities or allied regions. It could force the empire to commit attention far from its core. And attention in a time of crisis becomes precious. Imagine the Hittite court hearing increasingly troubling reports. Cities in the wider region are uneasy. Maritime threats are growing. Trade routes are less reliable. Neighboring states are preoccupied, and old assumptions about order no longer hold. Even if the exact actors were unclear, the system itself would feel less stable. There is a particular terror in not fully knowing the shape of a threat. A known enemy can be fought. An uncertain field of danger is worse. Ships appear. Settlements burn. Messages stop arriving. Is this a raid, a migration, a temporary disruption? The beginning of something much larger? Ancient courts, like modern governments, often had to act on imperfect information. And imperfect information in a collapsing system becomes a multiplier of anxiety. Send troops in the wrong direction and you weaken another frontier. Ignore a coastal threat and you lose trade or allies. Overreact to rumor and you exhaust the state. Underreact and you invite disaster. This is one more reason why no one noticed the Hittite disappearance in the way later generations wish they had. Because the whole region was becoming thick with overlapping dangers, and no one possessed a clean, high view of events as they unfolded. There were only fragments, reports, burnings, delays, fear. That is what history so often leaves us. The texture of confusion rather than the comfort of certainty. If you want a sleepier, gentler image of this chaos, picture the coast at dusk. A harbor that once meant arrival and prosperity now watches the horizon differently. Not every sail is welcome. Not every ship means trade. The water reflects orange evening light, but the mood is altered. Merchants speak more quietly. Guards watch longer. Messages are sent inland with greater urgency. The sea is still beautiful, but it no longer feels entirely kind. And inland in capitals like Hattusa, such changes may have arrived as a kind of distant dread, perhaps not immediate catastrophe, not yet, but one more sign that the wider order was failing. A state can sometimes survive if its problems remain regional. The Hittites might have survived a northern frontier issue or a western disturbance, or a southern conflict, or an economic shock. But if the coast, the trade system, the climate, the provinces, and the diplomatic order all begin to weaken at once, then survival becomes much harder. Too many fires. And one of the deepest tragedies of the late Bronze Age is that the states caught inside it did not experience it as the end of an era. They experienced it as emergency after emergency. That is another answer to our title's question, why did no one notice? Because no one had time to notice in the poetic, historical sense. They had only enough time to respond to the next message, the next shortage, the next attack, the next broken route, the next appeal for help. History later calls it collapse. The people living through it called it today, and today was already too full. There is a particular sadness in the final decades of an empire, not because everyone knows they are the final decades, but because no one does. If the people of late Hattusa had known with certainty that the imperial world around them was nearing its end, they might have written differently, prayed differently, stored things differently, hidden text differently, fled sooner, clung harder, remembered more intentionally. But people almost never know they are living at the end of an age. They think they are living in a difficult age, and that distinction is everything. And the later Hittite rulers faced a world that was harder to govern than the one their predecessors had known. External threats, internal strain, supply pressure, and wider regional instability all seem to have narrowed their room to maneuver. Yet the state continued. That continuation matters. It tells us that collapse was not immediate. Not total all at once, not theatrical in a neat way. There were likely moments of adaptation, improvisation, and temporary resilience. An empire does not become a ruin overnight. It becomes more expensive, more anxious, more brittle. Imagine Hattusa in one of those later years. The city still functions. Temple rituals still continue. Administrative work still happens. Officials still speak with seriousness. That the king is still king. But the atmosphere has changed. Maybe there is more concern about grain. Maybe there are more urgent messages from frontier regions. Maybe more officials speak in low voices after formal meetings. Maybe storehouses are inspected more anxiously. Maybe courtiers debate which threat matters most. Maybe people in the lower city hear rumors that the court tries to contain. A city under strain does not always look outwardly different at first. The changes can be tonal. A delay that would once have caused annoyance now causes unease. A missing shipment now feels ominous. A diplomatic slight now feels dangerous. A local disturbance now feels contagious. Late empires often live in such heightened meaning. Everything matters more because reserves are thinner. One of the most human things we can do is imagine the ordinary people in this phase. A scribe might still be copying a ritual text carefully even as the world outside grows more unstable. A cook might still be preparing bread for a household tied to the palace. A guard might still be assigned to a gate. A priest might still be making offerings meant to preserve divine favor. A child might still be chasing another child through an alley with no awareness of the vast historical danger. History contains both scales at once, the enormous and the intimate. The collapse of systems, and the persistence of breakfast. That is why ancient endings are so powerful. They are never only about states. They are about mornings continuing until they don't feel ordinary anymore. At some point in the Hittite collapse, Hattusa itself ceased to function as the imperial center. Whether through destruction, abandonment, strategic withdrawal, starvation, loss of administrative viability, or some combination of these processes, the city's role ended. Archaeology shows a capital that did not continue as before. The old central order was broken. This is one of the clearest signs of civilizational collapse. Not simply that a city suffers damage, but that the city can no longer serve as the organizing heart of a system. Once the capital goes quiet, the empire's story changes fundamentally. The center cannot speak. The archives stop growing. The court is absent. The roads no longer converge with the same meaning. What follows is not necessarily instant emptiness. People may remain in surrounding regions. Successor states may rise elsewhere. Cultural lines may continue. But the empire as an empire is finished. There is something eerily gentle in the phrase, archives stop growing. Because that is how historians often encounter endings, not through a final scream, through a final document, then nothing. No more records, no more orders, no more treaties, no more daily proof that the system still believed in tomorrow. And silence is powerful, especially when it follows centuries of noise. The Hittites had once been loud in the historical record, loud through administration, diplomacy, warfare, and ritual. Then, as an imperial civilization, they become quiet. That quiet is not proof that no one cared. It is proof that the institutions which normally preserve care had broken. This is another answer to the mystery. Why did no one notice? Because the very machinery by which civilizations notice, record, and remember was failing. A state notices through scribes, through envoys, through archives, through durable institutions. Break those and events can be immense without being cleanly narrated. The late Hittite world may also have experienced movements of populations, local fragmentation, and the emergence of smaller post-imperial political forms. Some regions in Anatolia and Syria retained cultural and linguistic continuities that modern historians sometimes call Neo-Hittite in later centuries. That matters because it reminds us that collapse is not erasure. The empire ended. The people did not disappear into air. Life goes on in altered forms. This is a comforting thought for sleep, even inside such a dark story. Human beings continue. After capitals fall, villages persist. After great political systems fragment, families still wake, eat, mend, bury, sow, and hope. After empires vanish, speech continues, memory lingers, and pieces of the old world survive in new ones. So the Hittites did not vanish in a magical sense. What vanished was the imperial pattern that had organized them. And because that pattern disappeared amid a much wider regional breakdown, the fall was not memorialized in the singular way later ages might expect. No neat final chapter, no unanimous obituary. Just a civilization losing the ability to remain itself. To understand why the Hittites could disappear without a clear, widely preserved response, we have to broaden the frame. Imagine an entire neighborhood of grand houses. Each house is large. Each has storerooms, servants, walls, and a proud family history. Each trades with the others, marries into the others, competes with the others. Sometimes they argue, sometimes they threaten, sometimes they host one another lavishly. Now imagine something goes wrong. First, one house has trouble feeding itself. Then another loses access to an important supplier. Then a servant runs away in one place. Then a fire starts in another. Then roads between them become dangerous. Then thieves begin appearing. Then a roof collapses in one corner of the neighborhood. Then another family stops answering letters. In that situation, if one house disappears, do the others notice? Yes and no. They notice in fragments. They notice as stress. They notice as rumor. They notice as one more thing going wrong, but they do not notice with calm completeness because they are engulfed in their own emergencies. This perhaps is the best model for the Bronze Age collapse. The Hittites were not alone. Neither were the Mycenaeans, and neither was Ugarit. Neither was Egypt, though it survived. And neither were the Levantine cities or the inland powers. Different places suffered differently. Some burned, some shrank, some transformed. Some endured, weakened, and later recovered, but the cumulative effect was enormous. This is why the end of the Hittite Empire did not produce a single stable external narrative. There were too few stable external observers. The broader audience was breaking. For modern comparison, imagine a newspaper trying to cover the destruction of one major institution while the paper's own building is flooding. Its communications are down. Half the city has lost power and roads out or blocked. Coverage becomes fragmentary, not because the event is unimportant, because the observer is compromised. Ancient states could be compromised in exactly this way. Egyptian records remember attacks and victories, but Egypt itself was fighting to endure. Mycenaean palaces disappear in destruction layers and reduced complexity, not in an orderly historical literature explaining everyone else's fate. Ugarit leaves urgent tablets, because it was too busy facing catastrophe to compose reflective imperial history. This is one reason the late Bronze Age collapse feels less like a documentary and more like a room full of interrupted conversations. A letter ends, a city burns, a palace is abandoned, a trade route vanishes, a kingdom shrinks, and across that interrupted landscape the Hittites fade. No one noticed in the sense of having time, stability, and perspective enough to tell the whole story, but everyone noticed in the sense of feeling the pain. That distinction matters. Sometimes the absence of a good historical narrative is mistaken for the absence of awareness, but the people on the ground were not blind. They were overwhelmed. This is a profoundly human condition. When too many things go wrong at once, attention narrows. You stop thinking like a historian and start thinking like a survivor. Can the gate hold? Will grain arrive? Can we trust the road? Should we flee? Will the king respond? Is that smoke? Who still stands with us? These are not the questions of later scholarship. They are the questions of frightened people. If the whole neighborhood catches fire, nobody pauses to write a polished account of house number 4 collapsing first. They are carrying water, running for safety, calling out names. And so when we ask why no one noticed the Hittites disappearing, the answer is not that no one cared enough to pay attention. The answer is that the entire region was becoming a place where polished attention was impossible. Crisis had eaten the margins. And without margins of food, time, security, scribal continuity, transport, and institutional calm, civilizations stop writing good endings. They simply stop. Histories of empires often focus on kings, and kings do matter. Their decisions matter. Their weaknesses matter. Their capacities matter. But the disappearance of a civilization is felt most widely by people whose names do not survive. So let us slow down and imagine the Hittite collapse from below, not just from the court, from the streets, fields, workshops, shrines, and households. A farmer in a village tied to the imperial system might not think in terms of the Bronze Age international order. He might think in terms of weather, labor, family obligations, and local demands. If taxes increase in a year of poor yield, he feels it immediately. If grain is requisitioned more harshly, he feels it. If raiders threaten movement, or if military demands remove laborers from the village, he feels it. Collapse, from his view, begins as pressure. A woman grinding grain or managing household stores might notice that food stretches less easily. That anxiety changes a home before it changes a palace. A family that once counted on stable access to resources begins to live closer to the edge. A craftsman in or near a city may notice shortages of materials. Orders change. Demand changes. Payment becomes uncertain. What was once routine work becomes irregular. A soldier stationed on a frontier feels collapse is waiting for support, waiting for orders, waiting for relief, waiting for supplies that are delayed, waiting for news that never fully clarifies the danger. A priest feels collapse differently. For him, instability threatens cosmic order as well as political order. Failed rituals, broken calendars, interrupted offerings, or the visible suffering of the people may all suggest divine displeasure or imbalance. A scribe feels collapse as discontinuity. Records become more urgent, instructions more strained, messages more desperate. Then suddenly, perhaps fewer records come at all. What is haunting about scribes is that they stand so close to memory. If the institutions employing them collapse, memory itself thins. And then there are children. Children always make historical collapse harder to think about because they are the least abstract part of any civilization. They do not know they belong to a great international system. They know where the gate is. They know where bread comes from. They know the voices of their household and the paths they are not supposed to run down. A child in Hattusa might have thought the city eternal because all childhoods feel eternal from within. That child's world would shrink not through understanding, but through atmosphere. Adults more anxious, food more uncertain, fewer familiar arrivals, rumors, tension and movement, silence where there used to be noise. That is the texture of civilizational loss, and not only burned layers and abandoned walls, but the emotional weather of people realizing that the ordinary world no longer behaves normally. This is why collapse can seem invisible to outsiders at first, because from inside it, people are still trying to preserve ordinary life. They cook, they mend, they argue, they pray, that they count, they sleep, they wake. History later says the civilization ended, but for those living through it, day follows day. That ordinary sequence is what makes the final disappearance so difficult to detect until later. Today still feels like today. Tomorrow still needs bread. The child still needs tending. The goat still needs penning. The gate still needs watching. People live inside continuity right up to the moment continuity becomes impossible. And when it becomes impossible, the loss is not only institutional, it is intimate. A family forced to leave a city, a household that loses access to a system of distribution, a shrine no longer maintained, a local memory that breaks because the elders themselves are displaced or dead. A civilization disappears partly when its institutions fail. It disappears fully when the habits that kept it alive stop reproducing themselves. That is a quiet sentence, but an important one. Habits make civilization. The same path taken to a storehouse, the same wording used in legal formulas, the same festival observed in season, the same expectation that letters sent will be answered, the same confidence that a distant king is still real enough to matter locally. Once enough of those habits break, the civilization is no longer living in the same way, even if some people survive, some buildings stand, and some traditions continue. That is why historians distinguish between people and systems. The people of the Hittite world did not all vanish, but the system that made them part of a Hittite empire did. And that system's death was experienced differently at every social level. For elites, it may have been the loss of office, status, and control. For merchants, the loss of roots and security. For priests, the interruption of sacred order. For soldiers, the failure of supply and command. For villagers, rising demand and rising fear. For children, a childhood that slowly became stranger. Perhaps no one noticed because everybody was too busy feeling it. That may be the most compassionate answer of all. No one noticed in a grand historical way because people were occupied with smaller, more urgent acts of endurance. Survival is not very theatrical. It is repetitive, practical, exhausting. And as a civilization fades, survival gets louder than memory. One of the most moving things in ancient history is the way writing can survive where voices do not. The Hittites wrote on clay tablets in cuneiform. Their archives preserved treaties, rituals, legal matters, official instructions, letters, and more. Because clay can survive when baked or protected by circumstance, these tablets allow the dead to outlast the institutions that made them. There is something almost tender in that. A scribe writes for a king or temple. He cannot imagine that 3,000 years later, strangers will read his words to reconstruct a vanished world. He writes because the state requires writing, because the ritual requires accuracy, because the message must be sent, because memory must be fixed, and then the state disappears, yet the tablet remains. This is one reason Hittite history feels both lost and intimate. We do not have a continuous narrative written after the empire's fall explaining everything neatly. But we do have fragments of its living bureaucracy, its prayers, its diplomacy, its self-description. And then eventually we have silence. That silence is not just the absence of text. It is the absence of an active system producing them. An archive is a heartbeat. As long as tablets keep being made, stored, referenced, and understood, the civilization's institutional pulse continues. Once the archive stops growing, once the scribes stop being trained, once the tablets are no longer central to administration, something profound has happened. The civilization's memory machinery has broken. This is why the Hittite disappearance can feel so haunting, not only because the empire ended, but because its own voice becomes interrupted. We do not get the final polished chapter. We get the sensation of a speaker trailing off in darkness. The broader Bronze Age gives us similar moments. At Ugarit, urgent letters survive from near the end. Their emotional power lies partly in their incompleteness. They show us anxiety in motion, not reflection after the fact. A city does not write elegant history when it is under attack. It writes for help, for action, for immediacy. And if help never comes, the archive freezes in fear. The Hittites likely had their own versions of this narrowing horizon, even where the exact last messages are not preserved in dramatic form. The structure of the evidence suggests a civilization whose organized voice stops because the institutions behind it stop. Writing requires stability. Not perfect stability, but enough. Enough trained specialists, enough administrative need, enough stored material, enough expectation of continuity. When all of those weaken, writing itself becomes vulnerable. This is one reason Dark Ages or post-collapse periods often seem quieter to historians. It is not necessarily that nothing happened. It is that fewer durable records were made or preserved. The world becomes harder to hear. That is also why the rediscovery of the Hittites in modern scholarship was so extraordinary. For a long time, they had largely disappeared from continuous cultural memory. Their ruins and tablets had to be unearthed, their language studied, their archives read, their history painstakingly reconstructed. They had vanished once politically, then almost vanished again from memory, and yet, in the end, not completely. There is something deeply fitting in that. A civilization that once depended on scribes to maintain its order is remembered today because some of those scribes succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. Their state died. Their records waited. Perhaps that is the gentlest version of immortality history can offer. Not survival in power, survival in traces. Tonight's mystery asks why no one noticed. But perhaps the tablets suggest another answer, too. Someone noticed enough to write. Someone noticed enough to record treaties, shortages, rituals, concerns, obligations, warnings. Not the final whole truth, but enough fragments that we can feel the shape of what was lost. And because of those fragments, the Hittites are no longer merely the civilization that disappeared. They are the civilization that almost vanished, and then spoke again through clay. If you are listening to this in the dark, this may be one of the most soothing thoughts in the entire story. The ancient world is quiet, yes, but not mute. Under layers of dust and time, its records remained patient, waiting for attention to return. And perhaps that is what we are doing tonight, giving attention back. Not to solve the mystery completely, it may never be solved completely, but to sit with it, to recognize that silence does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means interruption. The Hittite voice was interrupted by collapse, but not erased forever. One of the easiest mistakes in history is to imagine collapse as a total stop, as if one day there is civilization and the next day there is none. But people do not live like that. Civilizations may disappear, empires may end, cities may be abandoned, yet people continue. After the Hittite Empire vanished as a centralized imperial state, Anatolia did not become empty, nor did the broader Near East stop containing human life, politics, memory, or adaptation. What changed was the pattern. That word matters. Pattern. A civilization is a pattern of institutions, roads, authority, ritual, exchange, memory, and expectation. When the pattern breaks, people may remain, but their world is reorganized. Local centers gain importance. Long-distance systems contract. Literacy may narrow. Trade routes shift. Political life becomes smaller scale, more fragmented, or differently structured. For some people, this may have felt like loss. For others, like relief from imperial pressure. For many, simply like the conditions of life changing around them, and not everyone mourns empire. That too is important. The disappearance of a centralized civilization is not experienced identically by all. Some communities may suffer terribly because they depended on it. Others may survive by becoming less entangled in it. Some local elites lose status, others gain autonomy. Some religious systems weaken, others transform. History from below is never unanimous. Still, whatever the variation in local experience, the Hittite imperial order was gone. And once it was gone, later generations lived in a world where Hattusa no longer defined the horizon. That is a massive change. Imagine growing up in a region that once answered to a great capital, and then realizing that no message from that capital will ever again shape your life. At first, perhaps people still speak of it, still remember the old roads, still refer to the king who used to matter. Then younger generations arrive, and for them, the empire is already story. Then the story itself shifts, then memory fragments, then only archaeology waits. This is how civilizations disappear twice, first in politics and then in memory. The Hittites nearly suffered both, and yet some continuities remained. In later periods, especially in parts of Syria and southeastern Anatolia, states emerged that preserved elements of Hittite and Luwian cultural tradition. Later scholars often call some of these Neo-Hittite states. That does not mean the empire lived on unchanged. It means the end of empire did not erase all cultural inheritance. This is a soft and useful reminder. Collapse is not blankness. It is rearrangement. Some languages persist, some ritual habits endure. Some artistic forms survive, some political memories linger. Some names travel onward. Human beings are good at carrying pieces, not wholes, always, but pieces. And maybe that is why history for sleep can be strangely comforting. Even stories of collapse contain continuity. Not continuity of power necessarily, but continuity of life. A woman still teaches a child how to prepare food. A local shrine is still swept. A story is still told near a fire. A word survives. A carving style survives. A farming practice survives. A route once used by imperial messengers becomes a local path. The world grows smaller, perhaps, but it does not disappear. So when we say the Hittite civilization disappeared, we should say it carefully. Its imperial form disappeared. Its centralized power disappeared. Its capital ceased to function in the old way. Its wide diplomatic role vanished, but humans remained. The land remained. The sky remained. Seasons continued. That is the quiet balance we should hold tonight. Civilizations are fragile. People are stubborn. That stubbornness may be the oldest human story of all. And now we come gently to the heart of the question. Why did no one notice? By now, perhaps the answer is beginning to settle into place, not because no one cared, not because the Hittites were unimportant, not because the evidence is trivial, but because noticing in the historical sense requires conditions that were themselves failing. To notice clearly, a neighboring civilization must be stable enough to observe. Its roads must work. Its scribes must remain active. Its institutions must endure. Its political attention must not be consumed by its own emergencies. Around 1200 BC, too many of those conditions were collapsing across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The Hittites were disappearing inside a regional systems crisis, which means the people best positioned to witness and record their end were themselves under pressure, attack, hunger, transformation, or decline. The observers were compromised. That is the first reason. The second is that the Hittite collapse was likely a process, not a single event. No giant bell rang. No universally agreed date announced the ending. There was no one moment that everyone in the region could point to and say, there, that was the fall. Instead, there were pressures, shortages, raids, political strain, communications failures, abandonments, local losses of confidence, a capital eventually ceasing to function as before. Processes are harder to notice than catastrophes. A city burning is dramatic. A network fraying is subtle. A kingdom losing reach looks like bureaucracy failing until it suddenly looks like history ending. The third reason is that memory itself was broken. The institutions that preserve imperial endings, archives, scribes, centralized courts, stable successor states, did not carry the Hittites' final story forward in a complete way. Instead, the chain of memory snapped and much had to be reconstructed later from fragments. And the fourth reason is perhaps the most human of all. People living through collapse are busy surviving it. They notice danger. They notice hunger. They notice fire, silence, absence, fear. But they don't pause to compose broad philosophical reflections on the death of an age. That comes later, if later is stable enough to permit it. In the late Bronze Age, later was not immediately stable, and so the Hittites passed into silence, not unseen, but unframed, and that is the difference. They were seen in suffering, seen in letters, seen in interrupted systems, seen in disappearing roads, weakening borders, and emptying centers, but they were not framed by a surviving, calm world, able to narrate their disappearance beautifully. History often wants beautiful endings. Real collapse rarely provides them. It gives fragments, and from those fragments, thousands of years later, we try to reconstruct the shape of the loss. And if this answer feels sad, that is because it is. But it is also strangely merciful. The Hittites did not disappear because they lacked worth. They disappeared because they were caught in one of the great systemic crises of the ancient world. And perhaps that is why their story remains so fascinating. It is not just the fall of one empire. It is the sound of an age losing coherence. Part 13, The Ancient Mirror. There is a reason stories like this feel unsettling even in a calm room at night. Ancient history is far away, yes, but not so far that it cannot reflect us. We too live in networks. We too rely on distant materials, complex logistics, confidence in institutions, and assumptions that the large systems around us will continue to function tomorrow. That does not mean the Bronze Age predicts us. History is not prophecy, but it is pattern. And one of its oldest patterns is that complexity brings both strength and fragility. The Bronze Age world was brilliant because it connected far places. It was vulnerable for the same reason. The Hittites grew powerful in a world of exchange, diplomacy, and imperial organization. They became vulnerable within that same world when exchange, diplomacy, and organization began to fail across multiple fronts. This is a useful lesson, not because it tells us what will happen, but because it tells us how large systems often behave. They do not only fall from enemy assault, they can also unravel through stress, dependency, and cascading breakdown. That is what makes the Hittite story feel so modern in its emotional structure, even if everything about its actual world was ancient. Messages delayed, supplies strained, institutions tired, multiple crises overlapping, observers too burdened to understand the whole. It is not the details that echo into the present, it is the shape. And yet, there is something calming in seeing the pattern too, because the Bronze Age collapse did not end humanity. It did not end farming, storytelling, worship, adaptation, or rebuilding. It ended a world. Then other worlds followed. This is maybe the deepest comfort history can offer. Nothing lasts forever, but almost nothing ends everything. The Hittite Empire vanished. Human life continued. The palaces burned or emptied. Seeds were still planted. The diplomatic brotherhood of kings dissolved. Children were still born. The archives went quiet. The earth kept holding them until someone returned to listen. In that sense, ancient collapse is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of endurance in altered form. And that may be why it helps people sleep, because it reminds us that human beings have lived through uncertainty before. Not the same uncertainty, never the same, but uncertainty all the same. And always, in the end, someone keeps the fire low through the night. Someone tells a story, someone wakes at dawn and begins again. Part 14, walking once more through Hattusa. Before we close, let us return to Hattusa one final time, not as archaeologists, not as historians, just as quiet visitors in imagination. The air is cool. The city sits over the Anatolian land with the dignity of something built to last. Its walls trace the rising ground. Its gates stand as thresholds between outside and inside, between uncertainty and order. You walk upward, you pass stone. You pass spaces where officials once moved. You pass places where offerings were prepared, where words were spoken to gods and kings, where records were stacked in confidence that tomorrow would need them. You hear in imagination the ordinary city sounds that once filled the spaces: footsteps, animals, workers calling to one another, the scrape of tools, and the low murmur of administration, the ritual voice of a priest, a child laughing too loudly, a cook scolding, a messenger asking for someone important. All the little sounds that mean civilization is alive, and then slowly let those sounds fade. Not all at once. First a little less traffic, then a little more tension, then fewer arrivals, then more anxiety. Then certain buildings used less, then some roads more dangerous, then some officials absent, then some records not made, then rituals interrupted, then movement outward, then silence in places that once expected noise. This is how a city dies without a grand last speech, and it becomes less itself. And at some point, the city that once felt eternal becomes a place of memory instead of a place of rule. The people who left may not have known they were leaving a capital for the last time. The people who stayed nearby may not have known that history would one day speak of disappearance. They only knew that things had changed too much, that the old center no longer worked, that the horizon had narrowed, that life would now be organized differently. And so Hattusa entered the earth, not erased, buried, not forgotten forever, only for a very long time, until centuries beyond counting later, strangers came with questions, with shovels, notebooks, methods, patience. And the city began to speak again, not as empire, but as evidence. There is something beautiful about that transformation. Once it commanded armies. Now it invites reflection. Once it was a living center of power. Now it teaches humility. Once it expected obedience, now it asks us simply to notice. So perhaps in the end someone did notice. We did. Late, yes, but not too late to care. Part 15. The long, soft ending. So let the mystery settle now. In 1200 BC, a civilization disappeared, a real one, a powerful one, a connected one. A civilization of kings, scribes, treaties, temples, granaries, roads, and walls. And no one seemed to notice. But now we know that is only half true. People noticed in hunger, in fear, in missing shipments, in urgent letters, and in weakening roads, in abandoned responsibilities, in interrupted rituals, and in emptying centers. What no one could do was stand outside the crisis and narrate it clearly, because the crisis was too wide and too shared. The world was too busy collapsing to keep a clean record of its own heartbreak. That is the answer. Not indifference. Overload, not ignorance. Fragmentation, not a lack of witnesses, a lack of stable witnesses. And maybe that is why the story lingers with such strange power, because it reminds us that history is not only made of battles and triumphs, it is also made of overburdened systems, exhausted people, broken communication, failing confidence, and the quiet way ordinary life tries to continue even as the larger world gives way. If you remember only one thing from tonight, let it be this. Civilizations do not only disappear when they are destroyed from outside. Sometimes they disappear because the world around them becomes too unstable to sustain who they were, and then, long after, all that remains are fragments. Fragments of writing, fragments of walls, fragments of roads, fragments of memory, but fragments are enough to feel the shape of the loss, enough to honor the people who lived inside that world, enough to know that the Hittites were not small, not forgotten in their own time, not unworthy of remembrance, enough to understand that the silence after them was not emptiness, it was interruption. And now, as the night grows quieter, let us leave the ancient world as gently as we entered it. Picture the highland darkness over Hattusa, the stars above the old capital, the wind moving lightly over stone, the roads outside the city now empty, the storehouses dark, the temples still, the archives asleep beneath earth. No messengers arriving now, no royal seals pressed tonight, no carts crossing the gates, only the patient quiet of history after speaking. Rest there for a moment, in the silence after empire, in the calm after questions, in the long stillness where even mysteries seem content to soften rather than be solved. The Hittites are gone, their world is gone, but their traces remain, and because their traces remain, the disappearance is no longer total. Someone noticed, someone came back, someone listened. Tonight, that someone was us. So breathe slowly. Let the names drift. Hattusa, Anatolia, bronze, clay, grain, and wind to silence, and let them grow dim. The gates are shut now, the fires are low, the scribes have set down their tools, the king's road is empty, the harbor lights are far away. The tablets sleep in darkness, and history at last grows quiet enough for sleep. Sleep now. The ancient world is still, the walls are cool, the stars are high, and the vanished civilization which once disappeared almost unnoticed has been gently remembered tonight. Rest well.